Hi there. I would like to talk about feature stories today. Feature stories are really fun to write and they're fun to read. This is something that if you're going to be a journalist, something you really want to know. So a feature story it's actually told like a story. It has a narrative. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. How is this different from what we've been doing? How is a feature story different from what we've been doing? Just think about it for a minute. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Well, what we've been doing is we've been writing inverted pyramid stories. Do inverted pyramid stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end? No. We've been writing deadline stories or straight news stories. Remember, the inverted pyramid story is most important to least important. There's no middle and no end. You just tell the story in the order of how important is the information. The feature story is told with narrative. It's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that's how it's different. Feature stories take longer to write. They're more complicated. Feature stories have narrative. They have beginning, middle, and end. It's more fun to read a feature story. So that's why we have feature stories. The reason we have inverted pyramid stories is they're easier to write on deadline. It's hard to write a feature story on deadline. So that's why we write inverted pyramid stories. But if you have time, you really want to write a feature story. Think about it. When you're reading the newspaper, which are the stories that are most interesting to read? Probably the feature stories. You probably didn't even know you were reading feature stories. But if a story is written with a narrative style, it's a feature story. So one thing you want to be careful about is just because it's a feature story does not mean you throw all the rules out the window. You still have to follow the rules of grammar, punctuation, and AP style. You still have to be concise and clear. You still have to get the facts right. And you still have to be objective. Don't think because it's a feature story you can put your opinion in. You can't. All right, once again, we're having trouble with the computer. Here it is. Remember what a feature story is. Remember that it's told in a narrative style. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the types of feature stories, and we've already talked about feature leads and nut graphs, so we don't have to go over that again. But there are 6 types of feature stories: the profile, the explanatory, the issue trend, the investigative, the narrative, and the descriptive, or day in the life. The profile is looking behind the scenes at the people behind the issue. The people behind the issue. It's usually a profile of a person. So maybe there was an election and there was a key issue in the election. Who's the person behind that issue? An explanatory piece is a great way to tell a story about something that's complicated, like a law. If there's a new law in place, you could explain it. Or if some code was violated, you could explain how it works, how the law works. So that's a great way to explain something. Issue trend stories. The issue behind the news. You know, it's very easy to tell a story of an event because things happen, but it's very difficult to tell the story of an issue. People want action. But issues are what people need to hear about. Remember, the best stories are the ones that talk about things people don't want to hear about. So the issue is, so there was an event, but what's the issue behind the event? So there was a protest, Yeah, that's interesting, but what's the issue that they're protesting? That's the story. How does it affect people? The investigative piece is something that is you're looking at something that's in the public interest. So something's going on that's wrong, that might be wrong, that people need to know about. These aren't warm, fuzzy pieces. These are the ones that are going to expose something that's being done wrong. And those usually take a long time to write, like months. So these are what newspapers do really well. And that's why newspapers are really important, because newspapers do these investigative stories, and they expose what's going on that's wrong in society. Narrative is a story with a plot. So if the story is moving, it has action, that's a narrative. And then the descriptive, or day in the life. The day in the life story is really fun to write, and it's fun to read. Would be you spend a day doing something or following someone around and write down what happens. A day in the life. Like if you were going to you could do a police ride along and describe what happens on the police ride along. What does the police officer do all day? Or you could spend the day in one courtroom and see what are all the different stories that come about in that courtroom. Those are really, those can be really good stories. And then we've already gone over feature leads. Remember, summary, anecdote, scene setter, description. And then there's just some things about features. Remember, there's some leads to avoid. Some leads to avoid. And remember, when you're writing a feature story, get to the point. Don't spend a lot of time telling people what they already know. Tell people what the news is. Remember, the nut graph summarizes the story. It comes after the feature lead. And then the news peg, if you are writing a feature story and there's a news peg, like for instance, there's an event that happened recently that has to do with your story, put that near the top of the story. In other words, if there's something timely in the story, like let's say you're writing a profile of a basketball player. Well, has the basketball player done really well lately? We'll go ahead and put that in the beginning of the story. Not necessarily the lead, but near the top. Remember, the only way to tell a good story is to do great interviewing. If you don't do great interviewing, you're not going to tell a great story. It's not going to be a good story. It's just not. No matter how good a writer you are, if you don't do good observation and good reporting, you're not going to get good stories. So make sure that when you write a feature story, you're going to have a lot of information. You're going to have to cut it down. You can't use everything you've got. You've got to cut out the fat. So you're going to, sometimes that's really hard. But don't use something just because you have it. Even if it's a good quote or a good story, you have to think, does it help move the story along? If it doesn't help move the story along, cut it out. And remember to focus your story. Remember to focus. If you don't have a clear focus, then the story's all over the place and nobody's going to have fun reading it. What you need to do is just start reading feature stories in newspapers and magazines. And how is it different from the inverted pyramid, and what do you like about them? And just try to see what they do, and you can learn to write a feature story that way. But remember, if you are going to be a journalist, you have to write for the student newspaper and then do an internship. If you don't, you're not going to get a job. So start doing this so that you can, you're not going to be able to get a job just by taking classes. So make sure that you start working for the Mirror.